Story 1. The static and the silence. The first thing you notice isn't the darkness, it's the silence that follows. I was a sound engineer, living on the 27th floor of a downtown. My world wasn't sight, it was sound. The hum of the city was my lullaby, the distant wail of sirens, the growl of traffic, the constant, low-frequency thrum of a million lives, breathing in unison. My apartment was my sanctuary, acoustically treated, a fortress of controlled noise. I could isolate the sound of a single car horn 3 blocks away. I could tell you the make and model of the helicopter passing overhead just by the rhythmic chop of its blades. Sound was my language, my reality. Then the blackout came. It wasn't a flicker. It was a guillotine. One moment, my monitors were glowing, a complex symphony of waveforms dancing across the screens. The next, nothing. The light, the power, the sound all decapitated in a single, silent instant. The sudden absence of the refrigerator's hum was so profound it felt like a physical blow. The building's emergency generator should have kicked in. It didn't. I fumbled for my phone. No service. Not just no Wi-Fi. A complete communications dead zone. I went to the window, a floor-to-ceiling pane of glass that overlooked the sprawling metropolis. It was a starless, moonless night. The city, usually a brilliant constellation of electric light, was a black ocean. Not a single building, streetlight, or car headlight pierced the oppressive void. It was an absolute, impossible darkness. But it was the silence that truly terrified me. The city wasn't quiet. It was dead. No horns, no sirens, no distant shouts. The great living organism I knew was gone, replaced by a vacuum. I strained my ears, pressing one against the cold glass. Nothing. I opened the window, a crack, letting the cold night air spill in. I expected to hear something panic, maybe. People in the streets, but there was only the whisper of the wind, and even that sounded thin, muffled. That's when I heard the first new sound. It wasn't from the city below. It was from inside my building. A faint, rhythmic scraping. Scrape, pause. Scrape, pause. Oof. It sounded like it was coming from the apartment above me. My neighbor was a quiet old woman, Mrs. Gable. The sound was wrong. It was heavy, deliberate, like someone dragging furniture across a hardwood floor, but with a wet, dragging quality to it. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just someone moving around in the dark. I lit a few candles, their flickering light, casting long, dancing shadows that made my familiar apartment feel alien. The scraping stopped. I held my breath, listening. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than before. It felt watchful. Then a new sound. A soft, wet tapping on my front door. Tap, 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 tap. My heart hammered against my ribs. Who would be knocking? The elevators were up. I was 27 floors up. It would be a long, dark climb. Hello. I called out, my voice sounding frail and thin in the oppressive quiet. No, answer. Just another set of taps. A little more insistent this time. Tap, 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 tap. I crept to the door, my bare feet silent on the cold floor. I peered through the peephole. It was pitch black. In the hallway, the emergency lights dead there too. I couldn't see a thing. Who is it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. It was a sound I knew intimately, but had never heard from a human source. It was the sound of pure, dead static. A low, granular hiss, like an untuned radio, coming from the other side of the door. It was a sound without a source, a sound that shouldn't exist in a world without electricity. I stumbled back from the door, a primal fear seizing me. The static grew louder, a dry, crackling sound that seemed to crawl under the door and fill the room. It felt like it was scrubbing the air clean of all other vibrations. The scraping from upstairs started again, faster this time, more frantic. It was joined by other sounds from other apartments. Dragging, thumping, and that awful, wet scraping. It was a symphony of dread, conducted by the hissing static. I retreated to my studio, my sanctuary. I slammed the heavy, soundproofed door shut, my hands trembling. The static noise from the hallway dimmed, but it was still there, a persistent whisper. I sat in the dark, surrounded by my silent, useless equipment, and I listened. The sounds of scraping and dragging were now coming from all around above, below, next door. It sounded like every resident in the building was rearranging their home in the most violent, inefficient way possible. Then I heard it from my own apartment, from the living room. Scrape. My blood ran cold. I was alone. I knew I was alone. I lived alone. I had locked myself in the studio. The sound came again. Closer, scrape a heavy, dragging sound. The sound of my large leather armchair being pulled across the hardwood floor. I hadn't touched it. The static sound started to seep into the studio, not from the hall, but from within the room itself. It seemed to emanate from the shadows in the corners, from the dead speakers of my monitors. Big. It was a parasitic sound, eating the silence, part, and with it came the movement. I couldn't see it in the pitch black, but I could hear it. The subtle shift of a microphone stand, the soft thump of a book falling from a shelf. Things were moving. The blackout hadn't just turned off the lights. It had created a vacuum, and something was pouring into the emptiness. Something that moved in the dark. Something that communicated in static. I realized the scraping. The dragging it wasn't people moving. Furniture. It was the things moving. The people clearing the space. Making room. The handle of my studio door began to jiggle. A slow, deliberate turning. Block I had thrown clicked back with a horrifying finality. Prevent. The door began to creak open. I didn't scream. The static in the room was so loud now, so absolute, that I knew no sound I could make would ever be heard again. The darkness that spilled in wasn't empty. It was full, and as it washed over me, the last thing I was aware of was not a sight or a sound, but a feeling. The feeling of being erased. The feeling of being replaced by the deep, unending hum of the static and the silence. Story 2. The Tallow Men. We bought the farm for the peace and quiet. We never considered what kind of peace it was, or what owned the quiet. It was an old homestead in the deepest part of Appalachia, miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding dirt road. My wife, Sarah, wanted our kids, Lily and Tom, to grow up with dirt under their fingernails, not concrete under their feet. The old-timer who sold it to us, a gaunt man named Silas, gave us a strange piece of advice as he handed over the keys. When the dark comes deep, he'd said, his voice a dry rustle, don't light no candles, don't build no fire, you just stay inside and be still. The tallow men, they only come looking for the lights. We laughed it off as quaint local folklore. We were city people. After all, we believed in circuit breakers, not boogeymen. Our first few months were we repaired the porch, planted a garden, and got used to the profound silence of the mountains at night. Then came the blackout. It happened during a storm, a real monster of a tempest that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hills. The lights flickered, then died, plunging us into a darkness so complete it felt solid. The generator we'd installed wouldn't start. Our phones were useless, dead bricks. The battery-powered radio hissed with nothing but static. We were an island in a sea of black. Well, I said, trying to sound cheerful for the kids. Looks like it's time for board games by candlelight. I remembered Silas's warning, but dismissed it. It was cold, and the kids were scared. A little light, a little warmth was what we needed. Bye. I lit a row of thick tallow candles Sarah had bought at a local craft fair. They scent waxy and unfamiliar. Their light pushed back the oppressive dark, creating a warm, flickering haven in our living room. That's when we saw the first one. Lily was the one who pointed, her small finger trembling, as she stared out the large picture window. "Daddy," she whispered. The scarecrow moved. I looked. The scarecrow we'd built in the cornfield was just a silhouette against the churning storm clouds. But she was right, which it wasn't where we had left it. It was closer to the house. Maybe 20 yards closer. The wind must have knocked it over her, and it rolled. "Sweetie," I said, my own voice lacking conviction. "Purr." Then we saw another one, at the edge of the woods that bordered our property. A tall, impossibly thin figure, black against the blacker trees. It stood perfectly still, like a dead tree, but it hadn't been there before. I knew this land. I walked it every day. As we watched, a third figure emerged from the cornfield, and a fourth from the other side of the woods. They were all the same, tall, spindly, with long limbs that seemed to hang at unnatural angles. They didn't move. They just appeared. They were all facing our house, facing our light. "Mark, what is that?" Sarah breathed, her hand gripping my arm. "Bit tallow men." Silas's words echoed in my head, no longer quaint. A cold dread, colder than the storm, washed over me. Everyone away from the windows, I commanded, my voice tight. I herded them into the kitchen, away from the large panes of glass. But we could still feel their presence, be the feeling of being watched by a multitude of unseen eyes. I decided to take a risk. I had to know. I crept to the back door and peered through the small glass pane. One of them was standing by the old well, no more than 30 feet away. I could see it more clearly now in the faint ambient light of the storm. Peas. Its body was lumpy and misshapen, as if sculpted from greyish waxy. Its head was a featureless lump, tilted slightly as if listening. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth. Bah, I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my soul, that it was looking right at me. Then it moved. It didn't walk. It seemed to glide over the wet ground, its limbs unfolding in a series of grotesque, jerking motions. It was coming for the house. I slammed the inner bolt home and ran back to the living room. Blow out the candles, I hissed. Now. Sarah stared at me, her face pale with confusion and fear. What? Why? Just do it. She and the kids scrambled to blow them out, one by one. With each extinguished flame, the room grew darker, the shadows deeper. When the last candle went out, we were plunged back into absolute blackness. The only light was the intermittent flash of lightning from the storm. Outside, we huddled together on the floor, listening. The house was silent, save for the wind and rain. For a moment, I thought, I hoped, that it had worked. Then came the scratching. It was at the front door, a light, dry scratching, like a branch against wood. But this was different. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Then more scratching. At the windows, the back door, the walls themselves. They were all around the house, testing it, feeling for a way in. We could hear their strange, gliding movements in the mud. Outside, a soft, wet, shuffling sound. My family was crying silently, their small bodies trembling against mine. All I could do was hold them and listen to the sounds of the things that the darkness had brought. A flash of lightning illuminated the living room, and for a heart-stopping second, I saw it. A face pressed against the picture window. A waxy, featureless face, its surface melting and running like a warm candle, the tallow dripping down the glass. Where its eyes should have been, there were only 2 deep, dark thumbprints. Then, the worst sound of all. A soft, greasy squeak from upstairs. One of them was already inside. It must have found an open window, a loose bow. The tallow men didn't need to break down doors. They were formless, pliable. They could seep through the cracks. We heard its slow, gliding shuffle on the floorboards above us. It was moving through the bedrooms, through our children's rooms. We were trapped. The warning wasn't just to not light candles. The warning was that once they see your light, they know you're there. They know you're there. They know you're a source of warmth. Tallow is rendered fat. It's fuel. We had signaled to them with our little flames. we had advertised our presence. The shuffling sound reached the top of the stairs. It started its slow, inexorable descent. B. A thick, waxy smell, like cheap, rancid candles, filled the air. I held my children tighter, burying their faces in my chest. I knew then that the blackout wasn't a power failure. It was a dinner bell. And in the deep, hungry dark of the mountains, we were the flame they'd come to consume. Story 3. The umbra before the lights went out. I was looking at the stars. My mistake was thinking they weren't also looking at me. My name is Dr. Aris Thorne, and my life's work was housed in a small, private observatory, perched on a lonely mountain in the Atacama Desert. 4 years, I had been tracking a gravitational anomaly at the edge of the solar system, a wobble in the orbits of trans-Neptunian objects. That theory couldn't account for. I called it the perturb. My colleagues called it a ghost in the data, a rounding error. But I knew it was real. The night of the blackout, I was finally getting a clear reading. There, my custom-built telescope, lovingly named Cassandra, was locked onto the void where the perturber should be. My screens were filled with telemetry, light spectrum analysis, and gravitational lensing maps. I had a powerful backup generator and a satellite uplink, isolating me from the fragile power grids of the world below. I was a king in a castle of science, on the verge of the greatest discovery in human history. Then my world ended. Not with a bang, but with a blink. One of my monitors, showing a live feed from a NASA satellite, went black. Then another, streaming data from the VLT in Chile. My own satellite uplink chirped an error message and flatlined. Alarms began to blare. Within 90 seconds, every external data source I had went dead. A cascading, global failure. I stood up, my heart pounding, and walked to the small window that faced east, towards the distant, sleeping towns. There was nothing, no glow on the horizon. Just an impenetrable blanket, black. It was a planetary power outage, but my lights were still on. My generator hummed along faithfully. Cassandra was still tracking. My internal systems were fine. I was a lone candle in a worldwide blackout. Panic gave way to a chilling, exhilarating thought. I was the only person on Earth who could still see the sky. I was humanity's only eye. I rushed back to the main console, my mind racing. What could cause such a total, instantaneous failure? A solar flare of unprecedented magnitude, a coordinated cyberattack. I killed the alarms and focused on Cassandra's feed. The telescope was still pointed at the void, at the domain of the perturber, but something was wrong. Bob, the background, stars, the faint, distant specks of light that should have been there were gone, not obscured by clouds or atmospheric disturbance. They were simply absent, as if they had been erased. I widened the telescope's field of view, panning across the familiar constellations of the southern sky. Nothing. Orion, Canis Major, the Southern Cross all gone. The entire sky was a featureless, starless black. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. This wasn't a power failure on Earth. The power was fine. This was a light failure. The universe had gone dark, my hands trembling. I did the only thing I could think of. I repositioned Cassandra, turning it away from the deep cosmos and toward something closer. The moon. It took a few minutes for the sensitive motors to slew the massive instrument. When the image resolved on my screen, I felt my breath catch in my throat. The moon was there, but it was dark. Not a crescent, not a sliver. It was a perfect black disk, silhouetted against a slightly less black background. There was no reflected light from the sun. That could only mean one thing. Something was between the sun and the moon. Something was blocking its light. With a growing sense of cosmic terror, I aimed the telescope at the sun's position. I had to use every filter, every safeguard to prevent the instrument from being destroyed. The image that slowly loaded onto my screen was not the brilliant, fiery bowl of fusion I had studied my entire life. Pi. It was a thin, shimmering ring of fire, like a permanent solar eclipse. At its center was a circle of perfect, absolute blackness, a hole in the heart of the solar system. It wasn't a rounding error. It wasn't a rogue planet. My calculations had been wrong. Not because they were too big, but because they were too small. Infinitesimally small. Gravitational anomaly I had been tracking was just a whisper of its true nature. It was an object, an entity, of such scale and mass that it defied comprehension. It had moved into our solar system and positioned itself directly in front of our star. The blackout wasn't a loss of power. It was a casting of a shadow. B. Umbra. I spent the next few hours in a fugue state, running calculations, checking my data, trying to find a flaw, an error, anything that would make this impossible. The math was as cold and relentless as the darkness outside. The object was larger than Jupiter. It was not. Its gravitational effects were localized in a way that defied physics, suggesting a technology or nature so advanced it may as well have been magic. It didn't reflect light. It didn't emit radiation. It simply consumed it. Why? The question screamed in the silence of my observatory. Was it an attack? An accident? Or were we simply ants on a picnic blanket, oblivious as a shoe descended from the heavens to block our sun? Driven by a desperate, morbid curiosity, I decided to do something reckless. I disengaged most of the filters, pushing Cassandra's sensors to their absolute limit, trying to get a reading, any reading from the surface of the object itself. I wanted to see what was in the heart of that darkness. Sensors screamed. Data flooded my system, mostly gibberish and noise. But for a fraction of a second, I got something. An image. It was a texture. Not smooth, not rocky. It was structured B. A vast geometric pattern of unimaginable complexity. Like the surface of a microchip, the size of a world. And in the center of the image, In the center of the thing that was blocking our sun was something else. A change. A subtle shift in the geometric pattern. A slight dilation. My blood turned to ice. It took me a full minute to process the implication. The pattern wasn't just a surface. The structure wasn't static. The shift I had seen, that subtle dilation, it was the iris of an eye, a cosmic eye, staring directly at the sun. The blackout wasn't a shadow, it was a blink. I stumbled back from the console, gasping for air. We weren't ants on a picnic blanket. We were a specimen on a microscope slide. The entire human race, our history, our art, our wars, our love, all just a fleeting point of interest for something so vast we couldn't even properly perceive it. It hadn't come to attack us, it had simply come to look. The final, soul-destroying realization hit me. Then, the darkness wasn't the event. The observation was the event. The blackout was just the side effect of its focus. Bran. And as I sat there, alone in my tiny bubble of light, the soul witnessed the end of our significance. I knew the worst part wasn't the darkness. It was the horrifying, crushing certainty that at any moment the eye could finish its observation and simply look away. Poor story for echoes in the deep. There are two kinds of darkness. In the tunnels, the regular kind where you can't see. And then there's the other kind, the kind that sees you. For 15 years, I worked as a transit maintenance tech, a sandhog they called us. I knew the subway guts of this city better than the street. B-line, the G-line, the forgotten spurs and abandoned stations from the 1920s, there were my office. It was a dirty, loud, dangerous job, but I liked the solitude. Down there, the city's roar became a distant hum. It was peaceful in its own way, until the blackout. I was 300 feet down, inspecting a cracked section of tunnel wall between a mainline station and an old, decommissioned spur known as the Rat King's Folly. My partner, Dave, was 100 yards back, monitoring the signal box. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, damp concrete, and something else, something old and metallic, like dried blood. Suddenly, the track lights, the work lamps, my headlamp, everything went out. It was instantaneous and absolute. The silence was even more jarring than the dark, buffered rear, which always carried a low, menacing hum, went dead. The ventilation systems, which were the lungs of the tunnels, stopped breathing. The only sound was my own ragged breath and the frantic beating of my heart. Dave, I yelled into the oppressive black. My voice was swallowed whole. No echo, just gone. Dave, you there? Silence. I clicked my radio. Nothing but a faint hiss. The emergency backup system should have kicked in. They were on a completely separate circuit. For everything to fail at once. It was impossible. I felt a knot of cold dread tighten in my stomach. I decided to head back towards Dave. I knew this tunnel. I could walk it blind by. Placed one hand on the cold, grimy wall, and started shuffling my feet, one in front of the other. Shuffle, step, shuffle, step. The darkness was a physical presence, be pressed in on my eyes, making them ache. After what felt like an eternity of shuffling, I heard a sound. It was faint at first, but it grew steadily closer. Scrape, 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 scrape. It was the sound of metal on concrete. "Dave," I called out, a wave of relief washing over me. "Bet you, buddy. Did you drop your toolbox?" The scraping stopped. Brew. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. "Dave," I said again, my voice trembling slightly. That's when I heard the whisper. It wasn't a human voice. It was airy, dry, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. It seemed to come from all around me, a multi-layered hiss that formed a single, chilling word. Dot, dot, hungry, dot, dot, dot. I froze. Every hair on my body stood on end. I had heard stories from the old bee. Stories about the deep tunnels, about people who wandered down here and are never seen again. They called them the echoes. They said the perpetual darkness and the constant electrical fields change you, strip you down to your most basic, primal urges. They said you become an echo of what you once were. I had always dismissed it as drunken folklore. The scraping started again. Closer now. I turned and ran. I fled deeper into the tunnel, away from Dave's position, towards the Rat King's folly. My feet pounded on the gravel bed. My lungs burned. Behind me, the scraping sound was joined by others. A soft, wet, slapping sound. A low, guttural clicking. It was a chorus of nightmare sounds, and they were keeping pace with me. Brah! I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a heap against the tunnel wall. I lay there gasping for air, listening. The sounds had stopped. Maybe I'd lost them. Pulled myself up, my body screaming in protest. I had to keep moving. I started walking again, slower this time, conserving my energy. As I walked, I began to notice something strange. I could hear my own footsteps, the crunch of my boots on the gravel. But I could also hear another set of footsteps, perfectly in sync with mine, coming from somewhere up ahead in the darkness. When I stopped, they stopped. When I took a step, they took a step. It was my own echo, I told myself. The acoustics in these tunnels are strange. But then the echo became distorted. My left foot, which has a slight drag from an old injury, makes a specific sound. Crunchy. The echo ahead of me began to change. It became crunchy click, a new sound added to my own. I stopped, my heart hammering. I took another single step. Crunchy. From the darkness ahead, the sound came back. Crunchy, dash click, dash click. They weren't behind me anymore. They were in front of me, and they were learning me. Panic gave me a fresh burst of adrenaline. I turned back the way I came, only to hear more of them, the scraping, the slapping coming from that direction as well. I was trapped between them. My only option was a rusted service ladder. I knew was nearby, leading up to a ventilation shaft that opened onto a street-level grate. It was my only way out. I found it by touch, my fingers tracing the cold, corroded rungs. I started to climb, my hands slipping on the greasy metal. Below me, the chorus of terrible sounds grew louder, converging at the base of the ladder. I could hear them climbing after me. Blah. Their movements were jerky, inhuman. The clicking was right below my feet. I climbed faster, my muscles screaming. Finally, my hand hit the grate. It was heavy, cast iron. I pushed with all my might. It wouldn't budge. It was either rusted shut or locked from the outside. I was trapped in a metal tube with the things from the dark. I sagged against the ladder, defeated. The clicking sound was just a few rungs below me now. I could smell them, a smell of damp earth, spoiled meat, and charged ozone. A dry, papery hand brushed against my boot. I kicked out wildly, connecting with something that felt both hard and yielding, like old leather stretched over brittle bone. A chorus of angry hisses and clicks erupted from below. It was then I realized the truth. Planned, the Blackout hadn't created them. It had just freed them. The constant light and noise of the trains, the hum of the third railet, kept them at bay, confined to the deepest, most forgotten corners of the earth beneath the city. Bought in the perfect, silent dark. Their prison had become their kingdom. I pressed my face against the cold grate, peering through the slats. I could see the sky. The city above was as dark as the tunnels below. No streetlights, no cars, no sign of life. The Blackout was everywhere. There was no escape. A whisper slithered up the shaft from below me, clearer than before. It was my own voice, but hollowed out, stripped of life. It was an echo of my last shouted word, from what felt like a lifetime ago. Dot, dot, dot. They weren't just learning my footsteps. They were learning my voice. I looked down into the absolute blackness of the shaft, and from the darkness, a single, pale, phosphorescent eye opened and stared back up at me. It was an echo of sight. Soon they would have an echo of me. I closed my own eyes and waited for the clicking to stop. Story 5. The wrong room. My house has 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and 1 ghost. I just didn't know it until the power went out. I'm a creature of habit. Every night at 10 p.m., I lock the front door, check that the thermostat is set to 68 degrees, and place my glass of water on the right side of my bedside table. My life is a carefully curated collection of routines. My house is my sanctuary, a place where everything has its purpose and its place. Black annihilated that sanctuary. It hit at 10:03 p.m., just as I was heading upstairs. The world vanished into a thick, syrupy darkness. No flicker, no warning. Just an abrupt and total cessation of light and sound. The familiar hum of the house died, leaving a silence that felt unnervingly hollow. I stood frozen on the stairs for a moment, waiting for my eyes to adjust. They didn't. This was a deep, ink blot blackness. darkness that the moon and stars couldn't penetrate. My first thought was practical. Fuses a neighborhood outage. I felt my way back downstairs to the utility closet, my hands trailing along the wall. I retrieved the emergency flashlight, a heavy-duty mag light. I clicked it on. Nothing. I clicked it again. Dead strange. I had just put fresh batteries in it last week. I always put fresh batteries in it on the first of the month. It was part of my routine. Slightly unnerved, I found a book of matches and a candle. The small, sputtering flame was a comfort, casting long, dancing shadows that warped the familiar shapes of my living room. I decided to wait it out. I sat in my favorite armchair, the one perfectly angled towards the fireplace, and listened to the silence. After about an hour, a chill started to creep into the room. I glanced at the thermostat on the wall. In the flickering candlelight, I could just make out the display. It was blank, of course, but the physical dial was set to 50 degrees. I frowned. I never set it below 68. Never. I must have brushed against it in the dark, I told myself, though I couldn't remember going near that wall. I walked over and nudged the dial back to its proper position, the plastic clicking softly in the quiet. I returned to my chair. A few minutes later, I noticed something else. The painting above the mantelpiece, a landscape of a stormy sea, was crooked, just a few degrees off kilter, but enough to set my teeth on edge. I was meticulous about that painting. I used a level to hang it. I got up, my joints protesting, and straightened it as my fingers brushed the frame. It felt cold, not just room temperature cold, but a deep, penetrating cold, like it had been stored in a freezer. A genuine sense of unease began to curdle in my gut. These were small things, easily explained away on their own, but together they felt like a violation. It felt like my house was playing tricks on me. Bead do. I decided to do a sweep of the house, candle in hand. Everything on the ground floor seemed to be in order. I headed upstairs, the flame casting my distorted shadow on the wall ahead of me. I checked the master bedroom. Everything was as it should be. The guest room, empty, undisturbed. My office. My papers were neatly stacked, my pens aligned. Then I came to the fourth bedroom at the end of the hall, the one I used for storing. I opened the door and held the candle aloft, and my heart stopped. It was empty, completely, utterly empty. Boxes of old books, the disassembled crib from my nephew's last visit, pitch, the old computer tower, the spare winter coat all gone. The room was a perfect barren cube. The walls were bare. The floor was clean. It wasn't just empty. It was sterile, like it had never been used. I backed out, slowly, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. I slammed the door shut, my hand trembling so badly the candle flame nearly went out. This was impossible. I was alone in the house. The doors were locked. No one could have gotten in and emptied an entire room without making a sound. The blackout. It was doing something to this place, to reality itself. I retreated downstairs, my back pressed against the wall, as if the shadows themselves might reach for me. I huddled back in my armchair, the candle clutched in my white-knuckled fist. I did not move for hours. I just watched the flame, the only point of stability in a world that was coming undone. The chill in the air deepened. I looked at the thermostat again. The dial was now turned all the way down, as far as it would go. The painting of the sea was not just crooked. It was hanging upside down. A quiet, creeping madness was rewriting my home. Then I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. They walked the length of the hallway, then stopped outside the storage room. I heard the doorknob turn. A long, agonizing silence followed. Then the footsteps started again, but they were different, now heavier, and there was a new sound of soft, wet, dragging sound. The footsteps started down the stairs. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by a fear so profound. It was almost sublime. This was not a ghost or an intruder. This was the house itself. The blackout hadn't let something in. It had woken something up. Something that lived in the negative spaces, in the shadows, the silence. A parasitic consciousness that fed on order and routine. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. A figure emerged from the darkness, just beyond the reach of my candle's light. It was tall, vaguely man-shaped, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its head too small. It was a silhouette, a void, in the shape of a man. It stood there, perfectly still, and I knew it was watching me. It took a step into the light. It had my face, or rather, a distorted, nightmarish parody. The skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over a skull that was subtly misty. Its eyes were dark pits, and its mouth was a thin, lipless slash. It was wearing my clothes, the same shirt, the same pants. It was a reflection of me pulled from a broken mirror. P tilted its head, mimicking my own nervous hand. And then it spoke. Its voice, a horrific echo of mine, layered and discordant, like a recording played backwards and forwards at the same time. Wrong room. It rasped. It pointed a long, pale finger, not at me, but at the front door. I understood then. This wasn't my house anymore. During the blackout, while I was sitting in my chair, it had emptied a room to make a place for itself. Bend, and in doing so, it had made a place for me. I was the one who was out of place now. I was the goat. I was in the wrong room. It took another slow, deliberate step towards me. The candle flame flickered and died, plunging me into the same absolute darkness as the thing that wore my face. The last thing I heard was the sound of its breathing, calm and steady, as it came to claim its home. The last thing I heard was the sound of its breathing, calm and steady, as it came to claim its home.